May 12, 2017, London, 9:23 a.m. A nurse at the Royal London Hospital reaches for a patient's file. The screen is black. She tries another terminal. Black. She walks to the nurse's station. Every monitor in the ward displaying the same message, white text on a red background, clinical and cold as a death notice. Oops, your files have been encrypted. The demand, $300 in Bitcoin. The deadline, 3 days. The threat, pay or lose everything forever. She doesn't know what Bitcoin is. Down the corridor, an operating theater goes quiet mid-preparation. The surgical team can't access imaging. They can't pull the patient's blood type. They can't confirm medication dosages. The consultant makes a decision that no doctor should ever have to make in a modern hospital. He calls it off. The patient is wheeled back out, awake, confused, still sick. By 10 a.m., the phones start ringing across NHS England, then Wales, then Scotland. 16 National Health Service trusts are down, then 30. Ambulances are being diverted. GP surgeries are turning patients away at the door. Cancer patients are told their chemotherapy appointments no longer exist, not rescheduled, not canceled, simply gone, swallowed by a digital void that no one yet understands. This is not a power outage. This is not a server glitch. This is an attack. And it isn't just Britain. In the same hour, Telefónica's headquarters in Madrid lose their systems. FedEx operations across the United States go dark. Russian banks, the irony almost too sharp, begin reporting infections. Within 6 hours, the map of affected countries looks like a plague spreading in real time. Germany, France, China, India, Japan, Brazil, 150 nations, 230,000 machines, all showing the same red screen, all asking for the same $300. Somewhere in Pyongyang, no alarm sounds, no one panics. Because someone, in some room the world will spend years trying to find, already knows exactly what is happening. The question isn't what WannaCry did. The question is how a weapon built inside the most secretive intelligence agency on Earth ended up in the hands of a regime willing to use it on children's hospitals. That answer is more terrifying than the ransomware itself. To understand WannaCry, you have to go back further than 2017. You have to go back to a basement in Fort Meade, Maryland, where the most powerful hacking operation in human history was quietly being built. The National Security Agency doesn't advertise its offensive capabilities. It doesn't hold press conferences. It doesn't publish annual reports on the vulnerabilities it discovers in global software systems. But for years, decades arguably, the NSA had been doing something that would later seem in retrospect almost recklessly dangerous. They were finding holes in the world's most widely used software, and instead of reporting them, they were keeping them, weaponizing them, storing them in a classified arsenal that insiders called exploits. Digital skeleton keys capable of opening systems their owners believed were locked. One of those keys was called EternalBlue. EternalBlue targeted a vulnerability in Windows's file sharing protocol, SMB, a piece of code so old and so deeply embedded in the architecture of modern computing that it ran silently on hospital servers, factory floors, railway networks, and government offices across the planet. The NSA had known about the flaw for years. They had built a tool around it so precise, so quiet, so effective that it could slip into a networked Windows machine without a single login, without a single password, without leaving a fingerprint that most security systems were trained to recognize. They never told Microsoft. Why would they? A patched vulnerability is a closed door, and the NSA needed doors open. For years, EternalBlue sat in classified servers used in operations whose names and targets remain unknown to the public. It was, by every measure, exactly the kind of weapon you build and never let out of your sight. The NSA understood better than anyone what would happen if a tool like this escaped into the open. Then, in August 2016, a group calling themselves the Shadow Brokers appeared. No one knew who they were. No one knows definitively to this day. They surfaced on hacker forums with an announcement that read like a taunt, a dare aimed directly at the intelligence community. They claimed to have breached an NSA-linked operation and stolen its entire offensive toolkit. As proof, they released a sample. Security researchers around the world went pale reading it. The code was real. The techniques were real. The implications were real. The shadow brokers didn't release everything at once. They teased, they auctioned, they posted manifestos in deliberately broken English that felt more like performance art than cybercrime. For months, the security community watched, waited, and argued about whether the full release would ever come. On April 14, 2017, it did. The full NSA toolkit EternalBlue included was posted publicly online, free, downloadable by anyone with an internet connection and a reason to use it. Microsoft had actually released a patch for the SMB vulnerability 5 weeks earlier, tipped off reportedly by the NSA itself, which had finally understood what was coming. But 5 weeks is nothing in the world of enterprise IT. Hospitals don't patch on 5-week cycles. Governments don't. Factories don't. The machines running the world's critical infrastructure were overwhelmingly still vulnerable. Someone was already watching the release with great interest. In a country under decades of sanctions, isolated from the global financial system, perpetually starved of foreign currency, a state-sponsored hacking unit had spent years building one of the most sophisticated cyber operations on Earth. Not because North Korea had surplus resources, but because cyberspace was one of the only battlefields where a nation with almost nothing could still wound nations with almost everything. They had a name, though the world wouldn't attach it to WannaCry until much later. They were called Lazarus Group. And in the spring of 2017, they had just been handed the most powerful hacking tool ever built by the United States government. Nobody builds a cyber weapon overnight, not even Lazarus. The group had existed in various forms since at least 2009, a ghost unit operating under the direction of North Korea's Reconnaissance General Bureau, the intelligence arm that answers directly to Pyongyang's highest levels of power. They had already left marks on the world that most people had forgotten or never connected. The 2014 Sony Pictures hack, the one that destroyed internal servers, leaked executive emails, and ultimately forced the cancellation of a film, that was Lazarus. The $81 million theft from Bangladesh Bank in 2016, where hackers spent nearly a year inside the network learning its rhythms before draining funds through the SWIFT international transfer system. That was Lazarus too. They were patient, methodical, willing to spend months inside a target before making a single move. But WannaCry would be different. WannaCry would not be patient. When EternalBlue became public in April 2017, Lazarus didn't hesitate. They had already been experimenting with ransomware, a relatively new criminal model that had exploded in popularity among cybercriminals precisely because of its brutal simplicity. Encrypt the victim's files, demand payment, provide a decryption key upon receipt. The economics were clean. The anonymity of cryptocurrency made it almost impossible to trace. And unlike traditional espionage or data theft, ransomware produced immediate, tangible revenue, something a sanctions-strangled state needed desperately. What Lazarus now had was EternalBlue, a self-propagating exploit that didn't need a victim to click a link, open an attachment, or make any mistake at all. It spread autonomously, machine to machine, across any network where the SMB port was exposed. Pair that propagation engine with ransomware and you didn't have a targeted attack anymore. You had a pandemic. The code they assembled in the weeks following the Shadow Broker's release was, in technical terms, elegant. WannaCry, named for the file extension it appended to encrypted files, combined EternalBlue's propagation capability with a ransomware payload and, critically, a component researchers would later call a kill switch, a single, unregistered web domain hard-coded into the malware's code. If the malware could reach that domain, it would stop spreading. If it couldn't, if the domain remained unregistered, unreachable, it would continue. Why build in a kill switch at all? Theories differ. Some analysts believe it was a sandboxing detection mechanism. Malware researchers often run code in isolated environments that simulate internet connectivity, and a kill switch would cause the malware to go dormant in those environments, making it harder to analyze. Others believe it was an emergency brake, a way for the creators to halt the operation if it spiraled beyond intention. If it was an emergency brake, they never planned to use it. On May 12, 2017, at approximately 7:44 a.m. Universal Time Coordinated, the first confirmed WannaCry infection was detected in Asia. Within minutes, the self-propagation engine was doing exactly what EternalBlue had been designed to do, moving laterally across networks at machine speed, requiring no human interaction, touching every unpatched Windows machine it could reach. It crossed network boundaries. It crossed oceans. It crossed, with terrible indifference, into the servers of hospitals where people were waiting for diagnoses that would now never come. The NHS, running aging infrastructure on Windows XP systems that Microsoft had stopped supporting years earlier, was catastrophically exposed. There had been warnings. A 2016 audit had flagged NHS cyber vulnerabilities in terms that, read today, feel almost prophetic. The recommendations had not been implemented, the budget had not been allocated, the patches had not been applied. And so, on a Friday morning in May, the health service of an entire nation discovered that the price of that inaction was not a fine, not an embarrassing report, not a stern parliamentary question. It was silence. The silence of systems that had simply stopped. There is a particular kind of chaos that arrives not with noise, but with stillness. In accident and emergency departments across England, that stillness arrived at different times, in different ways, but always with the same quality. A sudden, wrong quiet where there should have been the hum of systems, the glow of screens, the routine mechanical confidence of modern medicine. Nurses stood in front of dark monitors. Doctors reached for records that no longer existed in any accessible form. Administrative staff stared at phones that connected to nothing useful because the people on the other end were experiencing the same darkness. At Barts Health NHS Trust in London, one of the largest NHS trusts in the country, the attack hit with particular force. Operations were cancelled, patients in waiting rooms were told to go home, staff were reduced to paper, to memory, to the kind of improvised human systems that medicine had spent 50 years building technology to replace. A consultant cardiologist would later describe the experience as practicing medicine with one hand tied behind her back. Except the hand that was tied was the one holding every piece of information she needed to keep people alive. The 999 emergency call system strained under the weight of diverted ambulances. Paramedics were told mid-journey to reroute. Hospitals that were already infected couldn't safely accept new emergency patients. Hospitals that hadn't yet been hit were bracing, watching their screens with the particular dread of people who understand that the wave is coming and there is nowhere higher to stand. Across the North Sea, Germany's national railway Deutsche Bahn watched its passenger information systems go dark. Departure boards across the country froze or filled with error messages. Travelers stood on platforms, disoriented, unsure whether their trains were coming. The railway's ticketing machines failed. Staff issued handwritten tickets. For a country that treats its engineering infrastructure with something close to religious reverence, it was a profound and deeply unsettling humiliation. In Russia, and this detail would later carry enormous geopolitical weight, the Interior Ministry reported thousands of infections across its own systems. State-owned telecommunications giant Megaphone was hit. Sberbank, the largest bank in the country, scrambled to protect its network. The irony registered immediately in intelligence circles. A cyber weapon deployed by a Russian allied state had struck Russian institutions with no more discrimination than it showed anyone else. WannaCry did not read geopolitical alignments, it read open ports. In China, universities reported mass infections as students arrived on campus and found lab computers locked. Petrol stations in some regions lost the ability to process digital payments, reverting to cash only. Manufacturing plants in multiple countries halted production lines because the Windows machines controlling factory floor equipment had gone silent behind red screens demanding Bitcoin. And through all of it, through the canceled surgeries and the frozen railway boards and the darkened factory floors, the ransom demands kept appearing. $300. Then, after 3 days, $600. Pay now or lose everything. Most victims didn't pay, not because they were brave or principled or particularly well-advised, but because security researchers working furiously through the chaos of that first day had already discovered something extraordinary embedded in WannaCry's code. His name was Marcus Hutchins. He was 22 years old. He lived with his parents in Devon, England, and he ran a cybersecurity blog under a pseudonym. On the morning of May 12th, he was doing what most people in his community were doing, watching the attack unfold in real time, reading technical analyses, trying to understand what he was looking at. Then he noticed the domain. Buried in WannaCry's code was a web address, a long, apparently random string of characters followed by a .com. The malware was querying that address every time it ran. If the domain responded, the malware stopped. If it didn't respond, it continued spreading. The domain didn't exist. It had never been registered. Hutchins registered it. The cost, $10.69. Within hours, the global spread of WannaCry slowed dramatically. Not stopped, new variants without the kill switch would appear in the following days, but the primary wave, the one that had infected 230,000 machines in 6 hours, was effectively braked by a young man in Devon who spent $10 and noticed something everyone else had missed. It was, by any measure, one of the most consequential $10 purchases in the history of computing. But the kill switch didn't unlock a single encrypted file. It didn't restore a single NHS system. It didn't return a single canceled surgery. The damage was done. And the people responsible were already invisible, already gone, already back behind the digital walls of one of the most closed societies on Earth. The world had been shown with horrible clarity exactly how fragile its infrastructure was. And somewhere in Pyongyang, the lesson being drawn was entirely different. In the intelligence community, attribution is rarely a moment. It is a process. Slow, argumentative, conducted in classified briefings and academic papers, and hushed conversations between analysts who are never quite certain enough to say what they know out loud. It takes months, sometimes years, and even when consensus arrives, it arrives hedged, qualified, wrapped in the careful language of people who understand that being wrong about who launched a cyber attack carries consequences almost as serious as the attack itself. The attribution of WannaCry was, by those standards, unusually fast. Within days of the attack, researchers at Google's security team published a technical analysis that identified striking similarities between WannaCry's code and malware previously linked to Lazarus Group. Specific sequences, specific techniques. The kind of fingerprints that sophisticated actors spend enormous effort erasing, and Lazarus, perhaps overconfident, perhaps rushed, had left visible. Symantec and Kaspersky followed with their own analyses, reaching the same conclusion through different methodologies. By December 2017, the United States government made it official. The White House released a public statement, an unusual step given how rarely governments formally attribute cyber attacks, naming North Korea as the actor responsible for WannaCry. The United Kingdom followed immediately. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Japan aligned behind the same assessment within hours, a coordinated diplomatic signal designed to make the attribution feel less like an accusation and more like a verdict. Pyongyang denied everything. It always does. But the technical evidence was, by the standards of cyber attribution, overwhelming. The code overlaps were not coincidental, they were architectural. Lazarus had recycled components from previous operations, a common practice in software development that becomes catastrophic from an operational security standpoint when those components have already been analyzed and cataloged by the world's best threat intelligence teams. They had used the same infrastructure, the same command and control servers, the same coding patterns that analysts had spent years learning to recognize as distinctly, identifiably theirs. There was, however, a dimension to the attribution that made Western governments deeply uncomfortable, one that the public statements carefully avoided dwelling on. EternalBlue had not been created by North Korea. It had been created by the NSA, a weapon that shut down the NHS, that froze Deutsche Bahn's departure boards, that canceled surgeries and diverted ambulances across the United Kingdom. That weapon had originated inside an American intelligence facility, been stolen by parties unknown, released publicly by the shadow brokers, and then repurposed by a hostile state into the most destructive ransomware attack the world had ever seen. The chain of custody was damning in ways that no official statement could fully neutralize. The NSA's practice of stockpiling vulnerabilities rather than disclosing them, a practice known in the intelligence community as NOBUS, for nobody but us, the assumption that only American intelligence could exploit a given flaw, had been exposed as catastrophically flawed. The assumption of exclusive access had proven false. The flaw had escaped. The weapon had been used against American allies, against American companies, against hospitals full of American patients traveling abroad. The argument that intelligence agencies should be allowed to hoard vulnerabilities for offensive purposes would never fully recover from WannaCry. Not because the practice stopped, it didn't, but because the counter-argument now had a body count attached to it. Congressmen and senators demanded answers. Cybersecurity researchers who had spent years arguing for mandatory vulnerability disclosure pointed to the NHS and said, "This is what stockpiling looks like when it goes wrong." Former NSA officials defended the practice, arguing that the benefits of offensive capability outweighed the risks of disclosure. The argument continues today, unresolved, in classified policy rooms and public congressional hearings with no clear winner and no obvious end. Meanwhile, the man who had accidentally stopped the attack was navigating a reality almost too strange to process. Marcus Hutchins became briefly the most famous cybersecurity researcher in the world. His $10 kill switch was covered by every major news outlet on the planet. He gave interviews carefully, cautiously, aware that his past, his years operating in legal gray zones, writing code that had been used in ways he claimed not to have intended, was not something he wanted examined too closely under a global spotlight. In August 2017, 3 months after he saved the internet, Marcus Hutchins was arrested at Las Vegas airport by the FBI. The charges had nothing to do with WannaCry. They concerned malware he had allegedly written years earlier, before he had repositioned himself as a defender. He would eventually plead guilty to 2 counts. In 2019, a judge sentenced him to time served, effectively no prison time, citing his WannaCry intervention as evidence of a man who had chosen, when it mattered most, to use his abilities for good. The hero of the story had a complicated past. The villain of the story was a nation-state that had weaponized stolen American intelligence against the sick and the vulnerable. And the entity that had built the weapon in the first place, that had decided for years that keeping a catastrophic flaw secret was worth more than patching it, issued no formal apology, accepted no formal responsibility, and continued its work largely unchanged. This is the world WannaCry revealed, not a world of lone hackers in dark rooms, a world of institutional decisions, geopolitical calculations, and bureaucratic failures whose consequences are paid not by governments or intelligence agencies, but by a nurse standing in front of a black screen holding a patient file that no longer exists. WannaCry was contained. It was never truly defeated. The cleanup took months. For the NHS alone, the recovery cost was estimated at £92 million, a figure that covered restored systems, cancelled appointments, diverted resources, and the vast, unglamorous administrative labor of rebuilding digital infrastructure that should never have been allowed to decay so completely in the first place. 19,000 appointments were cancelled in the immediate aftermath, hundreds of operations postponed. The human cost, measured not in dollars but in delayed diagnoses and deferred treatments, was never fully calculated. Some costs resist quantification. The legal consequences for those responsible were, by any honest assessment, minimal. No member of Lazarus Group has ever been extradited. No North Korean official has ever faced a Western court. In September 2018, the US Department of Justice indicted a North Korean programmer named Park Jin-hyuk, identifying him as a key figure in both the Sony hack and WannaCry. The indictment was detailed, technically sophisticated, and almost entirely symbolic. Park Jin-hyuk remains in North Korea. He will, in all probability, remain there indefinitely. An indictment without an extradition treaty is a document. It is not a consequence. The Shadow Brokers, the group that stole the NSA's arsenal and released it to the world, were never publicly identified. The most significant theft of offensive cyber capability in American history remains officially unsolved. Intelligence community insiders have offered theories, pointed fingers in various directions, but no charges have been filed, no arrests made, no definitive public accounting given. The wound remains open. What changed then? What did WannaCry actually cost beyond the immediate damage? The honest answer is less than it should have. Microsoft accelerated its end-of-life support decisions and released emergency patches for Windows XP, an operating system it had officially abandoned 3 years earlier because the scale of the crisis demanded it. Healthcare institutions around the world conducted urgent audits of their cyber infrastructure, found what they feared, and began, slowly, unevenly, inadequately, the process of modernization. Cybersecurity budgets increased in government departments across Europe and North America. Vulnerability disclosure debates intensified in policy circles, but the structural conditions that made WannaCry possible, intelligence agencies stockpiling vulnerabilities, critical infrastructure running obsolete software, healthcare systems chronically underfunded in their technology budgets, those conditions did not disappear. They persisted. They persist today. In 2021, ransomware attacks on healthcare systems reached a volume that researchers described as epidemic. Hospitals in Germany, France, the United States, Ireland, and dozens of other countries were hit by groups that had studied WannaCry's template and refined it. The ransoms grew larger, the tactics grew more sophisticated, the victims grew more vulnerable. The pattern that WannaCry established, that healthcare systems were soft targets, that the urgency of patient care created enormous pressure to pay, that the reputational cost of an attack could be absorbed and survived, that pattern became a blueprint. Lazarus Group itself continued operating. In the years following WannaCry, they shifted focus increasingly toward cryptocurrency theft, a cleaner, more profitable, and even harder to trace revenue stream than ransomware. By some estimates, they have stolen billions in digital assets since 2017, funding weapons programs and regime operations with money siphoned from exchanges and wallets across the global crypto economy. The cyber unit that crippled the world's hospitals did not slow down. It evolved. Somewhere in the architecture of that question lives everything we have not yet decided about how nations should behave in digital space, about what obligations intelligence agencies have to the civilians whose infrastructure they silently compromise in pursuit of capability, about whether the logic of offensive cyber operations that secret weapons are worth more kept than disclosed can survive contact with the reality of what happens when those weapons are no longer secret. WannaCry was a warning written in a language of catastrophe. The world read it, nodded gravely, and largely went back to what it was doing before. The next morning may not come with a kill switch.